All right, everybody. Welcome to this recording of Livestream Lecture number 2, which was the Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics. So, starting at the top, when we think about philosophy, you need to go back to the ancient Greek roots. Philo means love of or devotion to, and Sophia means wisdom. So, literally translated, philosophy is the love of wisdom or the devotion to wisdom. My definition of philosophy is that it's a systematic search for truth. Now, the reason that I say systematic is because what we're doing when we're engaging in philosophy is we are building philosophical arguments. We'll talk in week 3 about philosophical arguments and their parts. Briefly, just to give you a short introduction into that, a philosophical argument consists of a conclusion, which is the main point that's being argued for, and premises, which are the reasons that support that conclusion. In order for us to accept an argument, we need to go through and we need to subject it to rational inquiry. We need to ask if there are any fallacies or mistakes in the reasoning of the argument. We need to see what evidence has been given for the argument. So philosophy is not just your opinion, it's not just your beliefs, and it's not just a bunch of unanswerable questions. There are 4 main branches of philosophy. There's metaphysics. We also have epistemology, ethics, and logic. So metaphysics is the study of existence, like what is it that's out there? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, so how do I know about things? Ethics is the study of actions, and ethics asks, what should I do? So should questions are ethics questions. And then logic is the science of the study of reasoning. So in our class, we're going to focus on ethics and logic. Ethics is also called moral philosophy. And how do we see the differences between morals and ethics? Well, morals are not developed in a systematic way, the way that ethics are. Because remember, if ethics are moral philosophies, then that means to count as philosophy, they have to be developed in a systematic way, they have to be subject to rigorous inquiry, and they have to withstand that inquiry to be considered philosophy. Okay, so down to this whole idea of philosophy is not your opinion, it's not your beliefs, and it's not just a bunch of unanswerable questions. Those are some of the misconceptions about philosophy. I have a lot of students who tell me philosophy is just your opinion, it's just your beliefs, it's just the way you view the world, and that is not correct. Philosophy is a systematic search for truth. Your opinions are not the truth. You may have opinions that coincide with the truth. You may have beliefs that coincide with the truth. But the truth exists separately of our opinions and our beliefs. The truth exists whether we like it or not, and whether we accept it or not. One example of this is I used to believe when I was a little kid that the Easter Bunny came every year and left me candies and eggs for me to go find and all that kind of stuff. Well, that wasn't true. That was factually incorrect. And I found out later that it was actually just my oldest sister doing all those things. Another example of this is you may believe that someone else doesn't exist. I could believe that you don't exist, but the fact of the matter is that you do exist. So one of the things that I find difficult about our society is this whole notion of living your truth and being true to your truth. Well, you don't own the truth. You don't have your truth. You have your beliefs, you have your opinion, and you have your worldview. A lot of people will mistake philosophy for a worldview. They'll say, my philosophy about this. No, unless you have a philosophical argument and you have subjected that to rational inquiry and to the rigorous processes that we're going to learn this semester, you're talking about a worldview. You are not talking about philosophy. Because again, philosophy is a systematic search for truth. Why do we think that philosophy is a bunch of unanswerable questions? Because philosophy consists of those questions that have not yet been answered. So, philosophy is the world's oldest academic discipline. Philosophy was the first of all academic disciplines, and it was the mother of all others. All of the other academic disciplines that we have, including science and mathematics, physics, all of those came from philosophy. So originally all there was to study was philosophy, because philosophy was the study of all things. The early philosophers asked questions about everything. What we now classify as physics, chemistry, biology, math, medicine, economics, ethics, religion, language, politics, and business, all of those topics were once under the purview of philosophers. As philosophers discovered new truths about these things, their discoveries created new disciplines. So one example of this is, as philosophers began to discover truths about the natural world, those truths laid the foundation for a discipline called science. This is aimed at discovering, describing, classifying, understanding, predicting, and controlling the natural world. Science was first called natural philosophy. This is why some people mistakenly think that philosophy is just a bunch of unanswerable questions and that it never makes any progress. Often what happens is, when philosophers find an answer they're looking for, that answer is so important that it creates a whole new discipline. That discipline gets a new name and goes off to discover more truths, but people often forget that that discipline is an offshoot of philosophy. So philosophers that don't go join those new fields of study, those new disciplines, get stuck with all the questions that we haven't answered yet. So when you take a philosophy class, it may seem like philosophy is a bunch of unanswered questions. In reality, almost every major leap forward in human knowledge was the result of philosophers answering hugely important questions. So a philosopher is someone who must be open to anything being subjected to rational inquiry, and a philosopher thinks that nothing should be believed if it does not survive that process. So philosophers are concerned with, what do we know? How can we know it? What exists? What doesn't exist? How does the world work? And then our main question in this class, how should the world work? That should takes us into ethics. So sometimes it's difficult for people to understand what are ethics. And one way for us to think about this is, ethics are considered moral philosophy. Ethics are not law, they are not tradition, they are not etiquette, they are not social customs. Law, tradition, etiquette, social customs, and ethics are all ways that we try to control humans' behavior, but those are all different from each other. Just because something is a social custom doesn't mean it's ethical. Just because you have these rules of etiquette doesn't mean they're ethical. Just because something has traditionally been done does not mean it's ethical. And the glaring example of that is slavery. Absolutely unethical, but it was a tradition in the United States of America. It was a tradition in Britain. It was a tradition in almost all ancient cultures, including Rome. It was wrong. It was morally and ethically wrong, but they engaged in it as part of their tradition. Some people have trouble distinguishing ethics from the law. And as a former attorney, I can tell you, the law is not ethical, and it's not based on ethics. The law is written by people who have the power to write the law, and the vast majority of the time, they're writing laws that they think will somehow benefit them, whether it's the words of the law itself or them passing the law to try to gain more political power or to stay in office. One example of how law is not ethics is if you think about the idea of, so I used to be a criminal defense attorney, and I worked in the area of wrongful convictions. So what I was trying to do was I was trying to prove that my clients were innocent, that these people who had been found guilty and who were in prison were actually innocent of the crimes for which they were convicted. The attorneys in the United States are required to follow codes of ethics that have been written specifically for attorneys to facilitate the practice of law. One of the rules that you have to follow is a rule that applies to the attorney-client privilege. The attorney-client privilege is this thing where it says that communications that are just between the lawyer and the client about the case are privileged, which means that they cannot be disclosed unless the client discloses them. This is a privilege that protects the client. It's there for the client. It's not there for the attorney. And if an attorney violates that privilege and they disclose information that a client told to them in a privileged setting, the attorney can be disbarred and other bad things can happen to the attorney. So think about that privilege. The reason you need it is because you want clients to tell the attorney the truth. We can't have a functioning justice system without the truth, although whether or not our system is properly functioning is a question for a different day. So think about this situation. Let's say there's a criminal defense attorney who learns in a confidential communication from a client that that client committed a murder. And this murder is a murder for which an innocent person was convicted and sentenced to the death penalty. And that person's execution is scheduled to occur. So what should the lawyer do? The ethical duty that's imposed upon attorneys is that duty of confidentiality. If the attorney breaches that, then the attorney will be disbarred, the client could go to prison, all those sorts of things. Ethically, for civilians, for those of us who are not in the lawyer world, we would say that's wrong because an innocent person is going to be executed. So one thing to think about this is lawyers are often criticized for withholding information that normal people who are non-lawyers think should be disclosed in the interest of discovering the truth or preventing the possibility of harm. The problem with that is you have these conflicting duties, the ones that apply to the lawyer and then the ones that apply to society. So that's why I want y'all to see that ethics and the law are not the same. Another way to look at this is cheating on your spouse, right? It's not illegal in the United States to cheat on your spouse, but to many of us, this is something that's immoral. Although I would like to point out that in many states, if cheating on your spouse is the reason for the dissolution of marriage or the divorce, then it could be the case that you will have an unequal distribution of the marital assets. So it's best not to cheat on your spouse. Another example is in some countries, if you speak out against a dictator, that's illegal, but it's not immoral. Okay, so I just wanted to get through those things. Now there's another place that we'll talk about ethics and self-interest. We'll talk about that later in the semester, and though the relation between ethics and self-interest is contested, it is a plausible starting point to assume that we may have to forego our own self-interest in some cases, scale it back a little bit so that we can live in a society. And that's something we'll talk about under social contract theory. There are some people who ascribe to a theory called ethical egoism. I'm gonna go ahead and tell you we're not gonna spend much time on that theory because I simply don't prefer it. I have some serious problems with it. All right, so moving on down. What are the different branches of ethics? There's value theory, which is called axiology, normative ethics, meta-ethics, and then we're going to get into something called applied ethics. So value theory focuses on one life. It asks questions about what's good and valuable in life. And this is going to be really subjective because value theory really, like it says on the board, focuses on one person's life and not on society. Normative ethics focus on society and societal behavior and talk about how everyone should behave. Normative ethics ask questions about who's included in the moral community, how should we treat people and things who could possibly be seen as outside the moral community, and what it means to be part of that community. Meta-ethics asks questions about ethics. Applied ethics is where we go ahead and we apply these ethical theories to actual things that are happening in the world around us. And that's what we're going to do in the Ethics Bowl case paper. Hold off on asking questions about that. There will be a whole separate video just about that paper later this week. Most of this class will focus on normative ethics. Consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, contract theories, feminist ethics, environmental ethics. Those are just some of the many different types of normative ethics, but those are the main ones, and those are the ones that we'll focus on for the most part in this class. Now, some of you may be doing one of the assignments that's a response to the reading that's called a framework for ethical decision making. And in that one, they say that there are 5 main sources of ethical standards. And they say it's the utilitarian approach, the rights approach, the fairness or justice approach, the common good approach, and virtue approach. So with the utilitarian approach, this is where these ethicists say that the ethical action is the one that produces the most good or does the least amount of harm. Another way that you may hear this is the greatest good for the greatest number. That comes from philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And with the utilitarian approach, we're focusing on the consequences. We're trying to increase the good done and reduce the harm that's done. One example of this is the idea of ethical warfare. So this is where you have to balance the good achieved in ending something like terrorism with the harm done to all parties through death, injuries, and destruction. So we'll talk about those sorts of questions later in the semester. The rights approach. The ethical action is the one that best protects and respects the moral rights of those affected. This approach starts from the belief that humans have a dignity based on their human nature. You know, us being human, that gives us that dignity, and that means that we should all have the same rights and ability to do what it is that we want to do, what we choose freely to do with our lives. So on the basis of that dignity, humans have a right to be treated as ends and not merely as means to other ends. And the philosopher that's associated with this idea is Immanuel Kant. We'll study Kantian ethics, deontology, later this semester. The list of moral rights, including the rights to make one's own choices about what kind of life to lead, to be told the truth, to not be injured, to a certain degree of privacy. That list of moral rights is widely debated, and some now argue that non-humans have rights as well. Moving on, this is still that framework to ethical decision making. The third approach that they talk about is the fairness or justice approach. Now, this is one that started out in ancient Greece with Aristotle and other Greek philosophers who contributed to the idea that all equals should be treated equally. So now in modern philosophy, we use this idea to say that ethical actions treat all human beings equally, or if we are going to treat humans unequally, then it must be fairly done based on some standard that is defensible. Later this semester, we'll study the philosopher John Rawls and his theory of justice, and I'll explain those distributive justice principles. Next, we have the next we have the common good approach. So the common good approach is also one that came to us from ancient Greece. The Greek philosophers have contributed to the notion that life in a community is a good in and of itself, and that our actions should contribute to that life. This approach suggests that the interlocking relationships of society are the basis of ethical reasoning, and that respect and compassion for all others, especially the vulnerable, are requirements of such reasoning. So this approach calls to attention the common conditions that are important to the welfare. And when I say welfare in philosophy, we mean well-being. We don't mean like government assistance. But this is looking at the way that we all interact with each other to make life better for all of us. So with the common good, you may be talking about a system of laws, you may be talking about effective police and fire departments, healthcare, public education, those sorts of things. Last, we have the virtue approach. This is the most ancient of all approaches to ethics. And remember also, we're talking about Western philosophy in this class, not Eastern philosophy. So this started out with Socrates. in ancient Greece. Now, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. So, and through Alexander the Great and his, conquering much of the world at the time, that's how these ideas stayed alive. Now, virtue ethics says that the ethical action should be consistent with certain ideal virtues that provide for the full development of our humanity. These virtues are dispositions and habits that enable us to act according to the highest potential of our character and on behalf of values like truth and beauty. So with the virtue approach, some of the virtues that we see are honesty, courage, compassion, empathy, generosity, tolerance, love, fidelity, integrity, fairness, self-control. Virtue ethics asks, what kind of person should I be? So instead of starting with what is the right action, virtue ethics asks, what type of person should I be? And then the action would follow from that virtuous person. All right, there are a couple of other approaches we're going to talk about. Feminist ethics came from virtue ethics. It started out with ethics of care and then evolved from there. And there are tons and tons of different types of feminist ethics systems. And just to dispel some commonly held misconceptions, feminist ethics means that we're looking for ways for all people to be equal. Feminism is the belief that all people should be equal. That's what it means. We'll also talk about environmental ethics, which is an applied ethics, and we'll look at contract theories. Contract theories, especially modern social contract theory, is the basis of modern political theory and the basis of our modern politics here in the United States. So, there are some things that we need to keep in mind as we go through our ethical journey, some questions that we need to consider when we look at all of these different systems. We're going to ask, what is it that's good in each of these systems, and why is that thing considered good? How were these different systems developed? What are the positive aspects? What are the attractive things about these systems? What are the negative aspects? What are the things we don't like about these systems? What is the conception of the good life in each of these systems? What's the conception of the right action? And how do we foster or promote ethical behavior? One thing that I want y'all to keep in mind is that when you say should, or when someone says should, they're talking about ethics. I have tried much, much harder since I've been an ethics professor not to should people. The only time I try to should people is when I have actually considered in a systematic way, according to ethical systems, what I think should be done. Because remember, should questions are ethics questions, and ethics is moral philosophy, which is a systematic approach trying to find the truth. So, I would like for us all to pay attention. Just try to pay attention to the number of times someone tells you what you should or shouldn't do. I'm usually tempted to say, and what ethical system did you use to come up with this advice? Although people don't really like it when you ask them that, so I don't know, it depends on how popular you want to be and how much you don't care about popularity. Now let's get down to thinking versus feeling. This is one of my pet peeves, and this is something that has overrun our society. People often use the word feel when they mean think. My theory on this is that people use the word feel because feelings are not something that we can invalidate. Our feelings are something that we do not control. They're part of our lizard brain, that first part of our brain that kicks in reaction to something. But thinking is not feeling. Thinking is a process that we go through where we both feel and then we reason. So our reasoning brain kicks in after our lizard brain. Our reasoning brain makes us stop and think about things. But if you look at the structures of the brain and you think about how it all works, it takes us longer to reason. It takes us longer to be rational than it does to just intuitively feel something. Thinking is a process of using those feelings and then using your reasoning to come up with your thoughts. In this class, we think. We don't feel, because feeling is part of the process of thinking. If you're only feeling, you're not thinking. Now, I think that a lot of people use the word feel so they don't have to reason, and so they don't have to validate what they're saying. In this class, you do. Because what are we doing? We're studying ethics, which is moral philosophy. We're putting all of these things up to this rigorous standard, this rational inquiry, so that we can see what is the truth. Now, at the end of the day, after we've done all of these things, many times we're going to find that none of these systems are the systems that we want to use, that they all have flaws, which of course they do. And that's fine. But the point is that we need to go through this process and we need to understand these different systems so that we can determine for ourselves what sort of ethical system we want to adopt. You will be using ethics and engaging in ethics every day of your life. And that's why it's so vitally important that you take the time to really develop your own ethical system. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who has to look at yourself in the mirror. You're the one who has to be able to sleep at night based on what you have chosen to do. So my goal in this class is to make it to where it's easier for you to go through this system, for you to use rational inquiry, to apply your feelings and your reasoning, to think your way to something that is a system of ethics for you that you can live with. Okay, y'all. Those are the things that we went over in the live stream lecture number 2 for the second week of class. As always, if you have any questions, please send me an email at cc1021@txstate.edu. Alrighty then, y'all have a great day. Bye-bye.